The moment I walked into that house, I knew I had made either the smartest decision of my life or the kind of mistake you don't recover from. My boyfriend's mother opened the front door before I could even knock, which told me she'd been watching from the window. She looked at me the way you look at a price tag you weren't expecting, that half-second of recalibration before the smile comes. Her eyes moved from my hair, which I hadn't styled, to my coat, which was clean but not impressive, to the small canvas tote I was carrying instead of a purse. I watched her decide something about me in that moment. I watched the decision settle behind her eyes, like a stone dropping into still water. She said it was so nice to finally meet me, and her voice was warm in the way that expensive hotel lobbies are warm, carefully maintained, designed to make you comfortable enough to spend money. I smiled and said it was nice to meet her too. My name is Tess Waring. I'm 31 years old and I have something to confess. For the 11 months I dated the man I thought I was going to marry, I let him believe I was barely getting by. Not because I lied to him, not once, but because he asked me what I did for work early on. Second date, coffee shop on a Tuesday. And I said I worked in biotech. He nodded the way people nod when they've heard a word but not really processed it, and then he asked if I handled the administrative side of things. I smiled and said something vague about supporting the research teams. He filled in the rest himself. I never corrected him. I know how that sounds. I've thought about it a lot. Why I didn't just say it plainly. Why I let 11 months pass with him, thinking I split my grocery budget between the 1st and 15th of every month. The honest answer is this. My mother raised me to believe that the truest version of a person only shows up when they think no one important is watching. She spent her whole life testing that theory quietly, and she left me the results. My mother grew up with nothing. She put herself through school, built a small pharmaceutical consulting firm from scratch, and by the time she was 50, had more money than most people see in 3 generations. She never told anyone outside our family. She drove a sensible car. She bought clothes that fit well but didn't announce themselves. She cooked most of her meals at home, kept a kitchen garden, and gave generously to causes that never put her name on a plaque. When she passed 2 years ago, the modest house she'd lived in for 30 years turned out to be paid off. The accounts were not modest. She left me a letter with the inheritance. One line from it I've never been able to let go of. The people who treat you well when they think you have nothing, those are the only people worth keeping. So when my boyfriend, I'll call him by the name he used for himself, which was always his full name, never a nickname, never casual, when he mentioned in passing that his family wanted to meet me, that his mother was particular about these things, and I should probably make a good impression, I made a decision. I would show up as exactly what they expected. I wore my older jeans, a blouse that was nice but unremarkable, flat shoes that had been reused once. I drove my 10-year-old Civic, the one I kept instead of replacing, because I genuinely liked it, and I parked it behind a hedge of boxwoods that probably cost more to maintain annually than my car was worth. I was going to let them show me who they were. The house was in a neighborhood where every lawn looked like it had been groomed with tweezers, not in the way of someone who loves their garden, in the way of someone who wants the neighbors to know they can afford a service. There was a fountain in the front drive that served no purpose except to announce that there was a fountain in the front drive. My boyfriend met me at the door before his mother could get there, and he kissed me in a way that felt slightly performative. I noticed, and I put it away. Inside, his mother. Her name was Charlotte, and she moved through her own home the way a museum curator moves through a gallery, proprietary and assessing. Took my coat and handed it to someone I later realized was the housekeeper. Charlotte had a face that had clearly been maintained by professionals, hair that moved as a single piece, and jewelry that was real but not quite as real as she wanted you to think. I've learned to tell the difference. My mother taught me that, too. His father came in from a back room and shook my hand. He was a large, quiet man with tired eyes, not unkind, just someone who had learned a long time ago that it was easier not to engage. There was a third person at dinner that night, Charlotte's sister, who was visiting from somewhere in the South, and who I'll say had the particular energy of someone who considers themselves the life of every party they attend. She came downstairs 20 minutes late, kissed the air near Charlotte's cheek, looked at me once, and then began a conversation with her sister that made me as relevant as a piece of furniture. I stood there with a glass of sparkling water and felt as welcome as a rain delay. Dinner was served in a dining room that was aggressively formal. Too many forks, candles on a Tuesday, a centerpiece that blocked eye contact across the table. Charlotte opened with questions. She asked where I was from. A small town in Ohio, I said. True. She asked about my family. I said my mother had raised me on her own, which was also true. She asked what my mother had done for work. I said she'd been in business for herself. Charlotte made a sound of polite acknowledgement, the kind designed to close a topic that isn't yielding anything useful. His sister arrived halfway through the first course. She was a few years older than my boyfriend, with his same good bone structure and a sharper version of his confidence. She sat down without apology, poured herself wine, and looked across the table at me, like I was a word she hadn't been able to place yet. She said it was nice to finally put a face to the name. I said the same. She asked what I did, and when I said biotech, she nodded slowly, then said, "Support staff?" And the way she said it wasn't cruel exactly. It was more like a filing system. She was categorizing me. She finished with a small smile and turned to her mother to discuss someone's upcoming wedding. Then she said a name. The name dropped into the dinner conversation the way a knife drops, deliberately, with the specific intent to make a sound. She said she'd run into a woman named Vanessa at an event last weekend. She said it casually, like a weather report. Said Vanessa looked wonderful. Said Vanessa's family's company had just closed a significant deal with a real estate development group. I watched my boyfriend's face. Something moved behind his eyes and was quickly covered. Charlotte brightened. She said Vanessa had always been exceptional, poised, exactly the right fit for the family's world. She looked at me and said she hoped I didn't find these gatherings too formal. She imagined I was more accustomed to a simpler kind of entertaining. Simpler. I kept my expression open. I noted the word. I filed it. My boyfriend made a weak sound that might have been a protest, but resolved into nothing. His father looked at the centerpiece. I asked Charlotte to tell me more about the family's work, and she did, happily, at length, while his sister occasionally inserted the name Vanessa like punctuation. After the main course, Charlotte excused herself to check on something in the kitchen. His sister took a phone call. His father went to find a particular bottle of wine he remembered having. I asked my boyfriend where the bathroom was. He pointed me toward the back of the house. I was not, in fact, looking for the bathroom. I was walking slowly, paying attention the way you pay attention in a space that tells you things. The house was beautiful and cold, expensive art that no one looked at, family photos on a side table, and in 3 of those photos, a woman with dark hair and an easy, practiced smile standing beside my boyfriend at events that clearly mattered. Vanessa. I heard voices. I stopped. Charlotte and her sister, speaking in the low, urgent register of people who believe they're alone. My every instinct said to keep walking. Instead, I listened. Charlotte was saying they needed to manage this carefully, that the timing was not ideal, that the Waring Group, she used that phrase, the Waring Group, and I went very still, that the Waring Group's interest in the Hartley family was a significant opportunity, and they couldn't afford complications. I had never told my boyfriend my last name was Waring. I had introduced myself to him as Tess, and he had never asked for more than that. My mother's company had been absorbed into a larger holding structure after her death, and the Waring name meant something in certain pharmaceutical investment circles that it did not mean in a Tuesday coffee shop. His sister said that Vanessa's family was still the right long-term connection, that Vanessa understood their world, that this situation, and she paused, with whatever his girlfriend's name was, this was a temporary thing, that it would resolve itself. Charlotte agreed. She said they had a plan. She said the engagement party she was planning would serve as a statement of intent to their network. And after that, once things with Vanessa were secured properly, they would find a way to separate the two. She said there would be no shortage of reasons. These things had a way of finding themselves. His sister said it was helpful, at least, that the girlfriend seemed sweet but not particularly shrewd. That she probably thought this dinner was a real welcome, Charlotte said. That was probably the nicest thing about the situation. I stepped back from the doorway silently and walked to the bathroom I had originally been directed to. I ran cold water over my wrists. I looked at myself in the mirror that had probably cost more than my first car. I was not particularly shrewd. I thought about my mother. I thought about her letter. I thought about the fact that my boyfriend had never once asked my last name. I thought about the wearing name and what it meant and who else in that room might already know it and hadn't said so. I fixed my expression and went back to dinner. When my boyfriend proposed 3 weeks later, in the garden of his parents' home, during a dinner that had been staged as a casual gathering and was clearly nothing of the kind, I said yes. Not because I wanted to marry him. Because I wanted to see how far they'd take it. The ring was a statement piece. Big stone, slightly cloudy if you looked at the right angle in the right light. The kind of ring that photographs well, but reveals its compromises in person. I smiled and let Charlotte take photographs, and I ate dessert, and I let his sister toast to our future. Then I went home and I started working. If there is one thing my career has given me, it is precision. I am a principal scientist at a biotech firm. I have 3 patents, I've led 2 phase 2 trials, and I make more in a year than most people see in a decade. More relevantly, I know how to find things. I know how to document them. I know how to build a case that stands up to scrutiny. The Hartley family, my boyfriend's family, had built their wealth in commercial real estate development. What I found as I started pulling on threads was that the foundation had some significant dry rot. There were zoning irregularities on 2 recent projects, not enough to constitute clear fraud, but enough to make a regulatory body curious. There was a pattern in the financial disclosures that suggested certain investors were being given information. Others were not, which is the kind of thing that makes the SEC pay attention. And there was one specific thing, a contract that Charlotte had signed on behalf of the family company in a capacity she did not legally have the authority to occupy at the time she signed it, that was sitting quietly in a public filing, unremarked upon, waiting. I printed everything. I also made a phone call. There was a woman my mother had worked with for years, an attorney named Greta, who had been close to my family since before I was born. Greta knew everyone in the industry. She had a memory like a locked cabinet and opinions she shared only when asked, which was the mark of someone worth consulting. I called her and told her what I was looking at. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd heard the Hartley name recently, in connection with a development deal that had left some investors unhappy. She said she'd been waiting to see how that story resolved. She said she thought I might want to talk to a man named Aldous. Not Aldous from the names I wasn't allowed to use, just a figure from my mother's old network, and I said I thought so too. Aldous and I met for coffee twice. He was in his 70s, white-haired, with the particular patience of someone who has watched a lot of complicated situations resolve themselves over time. He had his own history with the Hartley family, a deal years ago that had gone sideways in a way that was never quite explainable. He had never been able to prove what he suspected. He had simply waited. He said, "When I laid out what I'd found, you're your mother's daughter," I took that as the highest possible praise. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday in April. Charlotte planned it with the energy of someone staging a theatrical production. 120 guests, a tent on the back lawn, a catering company that had done the governor's inaugural dinner. She sent me the invitation design for approval, which I found charming in its assumption that I would have no opinion worth noting. The week before, I sat down with my boyfriend for what I framed as a quiet dinner, just the 2 of us. us. I asked him, genuinely, how he was feeling about everything. Whether there was anything he wanted to say to me. Whether there was something I should know. He took my hands across the table. He said he was the happiest he'd ever been. He said I was exactly what he'd been looking for. He said he couldn't imagine his future without me in it. I asked about Vanessa. His face did something involuntary, and then sealed itself over. He said Vanessa was an old friend. He said it had been a long time. He said I had nothing to worry about. I said I understood. I bought a dress for the party that I had been keeping in the back of my closet for 2 years. Something I'd worn to a conference in Vienna, clean-lined, a shade of dark teal that my mother always said made me look like I knew something other people didn't. I had it pressed. I wore my mother's sapphire earrings, which had belonged to her mother before her, and which were not the kind of thing you'd recognize unless you already knew what real stones looked like. I drove myself to the party in my 10-year-old Civic. The valet looked at my car and then at me and offered to park me around the side. I handed him the keys and walked toward the tent. The first person to notice me was a man I recognized from a pharmaceutical conference 2 years prior, a senior partner at an investment firm with significant biotech holdings, standing near the bar with a drink in his hand. He looked at me once. Then he looked again. Then he excused himself from the conversation he was in and came directly over. He said, "Tess Waring?" I said, "Hello, Elliot." He said he hadn't known I was connected to the Hartley family. I said we were recently engaged. His expression did several things in rapid succession. He said his firm had just been reviewing a proposal from the Hartley Development Group, had been considering whether to invest in their next project. I said that was interesting. He said he'd love to catch up properly. I said I thought that might be worthwhile. Charlotte found me 20 minutes into the party. She'd clearly been watching the entrance and had tracked my trajectory through the tent because she arrived with the precision of someone executing a plan. She looked at my dress. She looked at my earrings. She looked at the group of people I'd been speaking with, which included Elliot and 2 other individuals whose names she clearly recognized because the color in her face shifted slightly. She said she was so glad I'd made it. I said I wasn't going to miss it. She said I looked lovely. And the word lovely came out with the slight strain of someone describing a painting they'd expected to be one thing and found to be another. I thanked her and asked if I could get her a drink. She said she needed to check on a few things first. What I noticed as I moved through the room was that the story was traveling, the way it always travels in a room like that, person to person. A word here, a check of a phone, a quiet conversation that pauses when someone new approaches. I could track it by the way people looked at me and then recalibrated. Who is she, really? The answer to that question was beginning to arrive. My boyfriend found me near the rose arbor, looking slightly desperate. He said we needed to talk. I said after the speeches. He said now, please. I took his arm and walked him toward a group of his father's business associates, people with actual decision-making authority in the Hartley network, and I introduced myself using my full name. I watched their expressions change. I mentioned my work and my firm's name. I mentioned lightly that we'd recently concluded a partnership with a pharmaceutical investment group, Elliot's group, which I named, that would be moving into a new phase of funding this year. My boyfriend stood beside me with the expression of a man watching the floor plans of his life being revised in real time. His mother appeared at the edge of the group. I saw her looking. The speeches started at 8. Charlotte took the microphone first. She welcomed everyone. She spoke about family, about legacy, about the future of the Hartley name. She spoke about the significance of this union and what it represented. And, as she spoke, I watched her work toward something, some point she was building toward, and I understood that the party was meant to be an announcement of its own. Something about a development partnership, something about new investors, something that would use the occasion of our engagement as collateral for a business play. When she called me up to the small raised platform at the front of the tent, I went. She handed me the microphone with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and she said she was sure I wanted to say a few words. I looked out at the tent. 120 people. Elliot near the back, watching. His father at a table with the tired eyes of a man who had been waiting for a reckoning for longer than he could name. Charlotte beside me with the careful stillness of someone who has placed a large bet and is waiting for the wheel to stop. I said I wanted to start by thanking Charlotte for the extraordinary effort she'd put into this evening. I said I also wanted to be honest with everyone about a few things. I said that when I first met this family, I made a deliberate choice. I chose to arrive as the version of me they expected. Unremarkable, modest, easy to categorize. I wanted to see how they treated someone they believed had nothing to offer them. The tent was quiet enough that I could hear the string quartet on the other side of the lawn, still playing, unaware. I said the experience had been illuminating. I described the dinner, the forks, the questions designed to establish hierarchy, the name that was dropped into conversation like a stone. Vanessa. The ex-girlfriend held up as the standard I couldn't meet. I described being called simple. I described the conversation I overheard, the plan that was being discussed, not 3 hours after I'd arrived at their home for the first time. A plan to use our engagement as a holding pattern while they secured something more valuable. My boyfriend said my name from somewhere below the platform. His voice was very quiet. I said there was more. I described what I'd found in the public filings. I described the contract Charlotte had signed outside her legal authority. I described the pattern of disclosure irregularities that I'd documented and shared that week with an attorney and a regulatory consultant who were both in the room. I mentioned Aldous, who had been patient for a long time and was no longer willing to be. I mentioned Elliot's firm and their due diligence process and what that process had recently revealed. Charlotte said my name once, sharply. Then she stopped. I looked at my boyfriend. I said he had had every opportunity to be honest with me. I said I had asked him directly, the week before, whether there was anything I should know, and he had looked at me and said no. I said that a man who couldn't tell the truth to the woman he claimed to love was not a man I was going to build a life with. I took off the engagement ring. The stone caught the light as I held it, cloudy and a little uneven, exactly like the promises it represented. I set it on the podium. I said my full name. I said where I worked. I said what I did. I said my mother had spent her life building something worth inheriting, and what she'd left me wasn't just money. It was a standard. I said the Hartley family had shown me their standard too. I stepped down from the platform. The tent parted as I walked through it. People stepped back, not unkindly, just making room. I heard Charlotte begin speaking behind me, something about misunderstandings and context, but her voice was already starting to sound the way voices sound when the room is no longer listening. Outside, the April air was cool and smelled like cut grass. I stood by the hedge of boxwoods for a moment, where I'd parked my car. I could hear the sounds of the party deconstructing behind me. Not chaos exactly, just the particular sound of a gathered thing coming undone. People deciding where to put themselves now that the map had changed. Aldous found me by the garden gate. He handed me my keys, which someone had apparently given him. He said, very simply, that it was done. I asked if it felt the way he thought it would. He considered. He said it felt quieter than he'd expected. He said that was usually a good sign. I thanked him for everything. He said to thank my mother. I drove home on empty roads. No music, just the sound of the highway and the occasional yellow light. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Small, comfortable, organized the way I like it. A kitchen garden on the windowsill that my mother would have approved of. I made tea. I sat at the table where she used to sit when she visited, before she got sick, and I held the mug with both hands. 2 weeks later, I read in a business journal that the Hartley Group had suspended 2 of their active development projects, pending a regulatory review. Their lead investor had declined to renew a significant commitment. The article quoted a source familiar with the situation, who said the issues predated recent events but had only recently come to light. My name was not in the article. I had asked Aldous to keep it that way. This wasn't my story to own publicly. It was just a wrong I'd helped make visible, and visibility was enough. My phone lit up that morning with a message from my boyfriend. He said he wanted to explain. He said there were things I didn't understand about the pressure he'd been under. He said he thought, given time, I might be able to see his side of it. I read the message twice. I put the phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the morning. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after you've done something that needed doing. Not satisfactions exactly, more like the feeling after a long breath out. My mother talked about it once. She said she thought the most important decisions she ever made were the ones where she felt that quiet afterward. Not relief, not pride, just stillness. She was right, the way she tended to be about most things. I deleted the message. I watered the herbs on the windowsill. I got dressed and went to work, driving my 10-year-old Civic through morning traffic. One more person on the road with a whole life no one could see from the outside. That's how I like it.